Hello, and welcome to the session where we'll cover Performance Max reporting in depth. I'm Laura Chevalier, and I'm a Developer Relations Engineer on the Google Ads API. I'm going to use the next 30 minutes or so to explain Performance Max reporting in the Google Ads API, which allows you to retrieve data about your campaign entities and settings, as well as data about how your campaigns are performing. Reporting is a massive topic, so we're going to waste no time and dive right in. Here's what we'll be covering in today's session. We'll start with an overview of what you can accomplish with reporting for Performance Max in the Google Ads API. We'll take a look at what resources Google provides for your API reporting needs. Then we'll cover some of the differences between reporting for Performance Max versus other campaign types. I'll spend time walking through some use case-driven examples of how you might query the API. And finally, we'll review best practices for reporting, both specific to Performance Max and for API reporting more generally. This talk is designed to help developers who are new to Performance Max reporting in the API and those who have some experience and are looking to level up to more advanced usage. While there is some general product-related information throughout, we'll be viewing it through the lens of technical implementation. The session will get more advanced as we go along, and I'll build on concepts introduced earlier in the session. If you're completely new to reporting in the API in general, you might find some of this content hard to follow, but I think you'll still be able to get plenty of value from the concepts we'll be covering. Before I continue, a quick reminder that the Q&A is available for any questions or feedback that arise during the session. So, what can you accomplish with Performance Max API reporting? What are the end goals of everything we'll be looking at in this session? I think of Performance Max reporting as addressing 4 main categories of use cases. We'll see examples of each of them later on. First is to retrieve existing resources. Second is to measure performance in relation to your business goals. Third is to optimize your campaigns. And fourth is to identify market opportunities. These use cases are generally true of reporting in the API, but there are some Performance Max specific ways of accomplishing each, which we'll dive into here. Before we get to the details of how we accomplish those goals, let's take a quick look at what reporting resources are available to do so. These resources are for the PMax entities themselves. You'll notice there are several reports that you might not already be using for different campaign types. I'll explain these more soon. You'll also see that there are some retail-specific reports here. Much of what I'll say throughout this session applies across business goals, whether that's lead generation, online sales with a product feed, or travel goals. But there are some resources that are only relevant for retail goals. I won't have time to cover everything, but I'll give some examples both for retail-specific use cases and for standard goals. This list is only going to grow, so I recommend checking out the Performance Max guide in our developer documentation to get the latest information about what reporting resources are available. In addition to those direct reporting resources, we have some supplemental resources related to targeting and insights. You might come up with creative new ways to leverage these resources, or even resources I don't mention here. Combining the API with your own application data, the options for optimization and insight are endless. If you're familiar with reporting for other campaign types, you might be wondering, how is PMax reporting different from what I've used before? With Performance Max, ads are generated dynamically using your assets and, if enabled, your automatically created assets. As a result, the focus of PMax campaigns is away from ads and towards assets, asset groups, and asset combinations. As Devin mentioned in his earlier session on everything about asset groups, assets are like building blocks which, when assembled together, make ads. Google AI constructs the blocks in different variations, sizes, and formats for you, while respecting the brand requirements specified in your brand guidelines. The fact of Performance Max campaigns being AI-driven changes how you interact with reporting. For example, there's no reporting on manual bidding types or audience targeting, such as with the campaign audience view and ad group audience view reports, which you might be familiar with for other campaign types, as PMax favors automatic bidding and audience signals. Similarly, ad and ad group reporting resources which aren't relevant for PMax are replaced by reports that are asset and asset group focused. To evaluate individual asset performance, the API provides performance labels that tell you whether the performance is low, good, best, or still learning. At the asset group level, you get a new ad strength field, which provides a measure of how well your asset group entities are set up for optimal ad performance. Also new with Performance Max are holistic, insight-based reports. In the context of AI-driven optimization, granular performance metrics aren't necessarily the best way to improve your campaigns to achieve your business goals. In fact, trying to optimize performance based on low-level metrics can disrupt AI learning and detract from long-term performance gains if you don't also consult higher-level performance indicators. For this reason, Google provides some new reporting functionality that helps you take an insights-based approach to optimizing your ads and, ultimately, your business to reach your users. That said, detailed metrics continue to be available at the campaign level and are available at the asset group level as well. In a minute, we'll start looking at some use case-driven examples that'll make it more clear what this new PMax reporting paradigm looks like in practice. I mentioned ad groups are out and asset groups are in, so how does that translate in reporting? You can think of asset groups as the closest thing to ad groups when it comes to PMax reporting. I want to stress, though, that this isn't a one-to-one comparison, and we don't recommend trying to compare ad groups from one campaign to asset groups in another. If you wanted to compare performance between your PMax campaigns and other campaign types, you might look at the campaign level and make sure to compare the performance of all existing campaigns with exposure to the audiences Performance Max can reach. What about asset level and asset combination reporting? We support these, and we'll get to that in a bit. Now that we've seen the paradigm shift that comes with Performance Max campaigns, let's dive into some example queries to better understand what we can achieve with Performance Max reporting and how this looks in the API. As a reminder, the four main use cases for Performance Max reporting are retrieve existing resources, measure performance in relation to business goals, optimize your Performance Max campaigns, and identify market opportunities. I'm going to give examples for all of these use cases, starting simple and getting a bit more advanced as we go. With each example, I encourage you to consider how you might update the query to accomplish your specific business goals. What other fields might you query? What reporting resources could you combine data from? And what business data might you further leverage to deepen the insights you can gain from these reports? Let's start with our first use case and a basic example. Say we want to retrieve all of our Performance Max campaigns. Using the Google Ads Query Language, or GAQL, we select the fields we need from the campaign resource and make sure we're only selecting Performance Max campaigns by adding the filter where campaign.advertising channel type equals Performance Max. As a primer for those who haven't used reporting in the API before, you can send this query to the Google Ads API in a Google Ads Service.searchStream request. This query selects some basic fields, the campaign name, the resource name, which uniquely identifies the campaign, and the start and end date. There's a number of other fields you might want to select to get information about your campaign, depending on your application logic. For example, you could also select budget, bidding strategy, labels, and status. You can find a full list of fields queryable with the campaign resource by leveraging the Google Ads Query Builder in our developer documentation. In fact, you can use this resource to view all of the fields that are queryable and which fields can be queried with one another for any reporting resource in the API. I highly recommend consulting this tool whenever you're building out a new GAQL query. The tool is located within the Reports tab, where you can also find a complete list of reporting resources. Moving on to our second use case, measuring performance in relation to business goals. This is where we'll start to see some examples of the PMax reporting paradigm shift in practice. You can use the campaign report similar to how you might use it for other campaign types. Plus, we have some new approaches for PMax specifically. A high-level campaign performance report might look like this, where we look at a selection of campaign metrics, segmented by date over the last 7 days. Our results consist of a Google Ads row for each Performance Max campaign for each day in the last 7 days. Here's an example of a JSON response from the REST API. We have a Google Ads row object, which contains an object for each component of the query, campaign, metrics, and segments. Note there are a couple of changes from our first query now that we've added in the segments.date field. One is that our results are broken up across multiple rows, one for each date. Another is that our results will exclude any rows for which the selected metrics are all 0. For example, suppose my campaign had no impressions, clicks, conversions, or cost for July 9th, 2024. Because all of the selected metrics are 0, this row won't be returned at all. Rows where any of the selected metrics are non-zero will be returned. Returning to our query, I've added a few fields. The conversions metrics you want to retrieve might depend on which bidding strategy you've decided to use. If you're using maximize conversions because you aren't tracking values and you care about all of your conversions equally, then the more relevant conversion metric is conversions. If instead you're using maximize conversion value and tracking values with your conversions, the more relevant metric is conversions value. Okay, that's Performance Max campaign metrics in general. What about Performance Max for online sales with a product feed? We can isolate PMax for retail campaign performance by adding an extra filter where the merchant ID on the shopping setting field of the campaign is not null, since we're required to set that field on PMax campaigns for retail. I could further narrow it down to a specific product feed label by adding another filter on shopping setting.feed label. For example, here I filtered the results to performance for all campaigns that target products on clearance. So we've seen campaign-level performance metrics, but what about more granular performance measurement? We also make performance metrics available at the asset group level, as you saw earlier. This is similar to looking at ad group level performance metrics, since the assets in an asset group are combined to create a subset of the ads that run for a given campaign. For retail goals, we could also look at performance at the product level by using one of our retail-specific reporting resources, Shopping Performance View, which maps to the Products tab in the Google Ads UI. Note that you need to add the product channel, product merchant ID, product feed label, and product language segments in order for each row to map to a single product in your Merchant Center feed, since all of these fields contribute to the product's unique key. If we wanted to take this idea a step further and look at how product performance varies across different asset groups, or which product categories are performing best in a given asset group, we could instead use the Asset Group Product Group View resource. With the Asset Group Product Group View resource, I can select information about my listing group filters, like product category or product item ID. If I have discrete product groupings across asset groups, you can imagine how I could leverage this to compare product or product category performance across asset groups. You might find, for instance, that some products or categories perform better in one asset group versus another. And in that sense, you can experiment with how different products perform with different groupings of assets. For example, let's say I have a pair of sunglasses and a skater dress that I've paired in 2 different asset groups so that I can leverage different creatives or reach unique audiences for each group. Perhaps when I query the Asset Group Product Group View resource, I find that my sunglasses actually have way more impressions in one asset group compared to another, but my skater dress has way fewer. This might tell me something about what sort of assets are drawing users to different products or categories of products. I want to move on to the next PMax reporting use case, but first I'll call your attention to something I think is pretty important when it comes to achieving success with PMax, which is that your asset group setup is hugely impactful not only for achieving your business goals, as my colleague Devin showed in his session on asset groups, but also for being able to report on your campaigns and iterate to improve your ads over time. It may be wise to think about what you want to achieve with reporting, what data you want to get out of your PMax campaigns, and work backwards from there as to what asset group setup you need to support that. Okay, we've seen how you can query various reports to retrieve existing resources and to measure performance in relation to your business goals. Maybe you've already been inspired as to how you might be able to optimize your PMax campaigns for your particular business needs using some of the reporting resources we've discussed. But we've only scratched the surface, so let's dig a little deeper into some examples of how you might use PMax reporting in the API to optimize your campaign performance and ultimately reach the right customers at the right time. Assets are where you really have the opportunity to pull different levers to improve your campaign performance. So let's start there. When your campaign is just getting started and your asset groups are still new, it's important to set aside time for Google to learn about what assets perform best in the context of your specified business goal and which combinations perform best together. Wait 3 to 4 weeks or longer for smaller campaigns or longer-term goals like lead generation before making optimization decisions based on asset group performance indicators. Frequent changes can result in performance fluctuations, but waiting and letting AI optimize before you step in will allow you to drive campaign performance that much further. Once you've waited at least 3 to 4 weeks, our recommendation to optimize your asset groups is to identify and replace your lower performing assets, but only after you've added the maximum number of assets. When it comes to Google's AI optimization, reaching the maximum number of assets is the best way to ensure your asset groups perform well. Only after that point do we recommend replacing assets based on their performance label. In order to replace any lower performing assets, you'd need to first retrieve the asset groups containing the maximum number of assets. Ideally, you would already have this information stored locally in your database so that you don't need to query the API every time you want this data. For that to happen, you can write a copy of your asset group entities to wherever you store your Google Ads data, for example, a database, immediately after successful creation. Then when it comes time to calculating things like asset group size, you don't even need to query the Google Ads API. So whether you've determined the number of assets per asset group based on data stored locally on the client, or based on the results of querying the asset group asset resource, we now have the asset groups with the maximum number of assets. Really quick aside, for those asset groups that don't have the maximum number of assets, we highly recommend adding more assets and reaching that max, while also varying the aspect ratios and content across assets to optimize inputs for Google's AI. There's a maximum limit per each type of asset, so you could add the asset field type to your query to determine how many assets of each type you have in your asset group. So now that we have all of the info we need to identify asset groups with the maximum number of assets, all we need is the performance label. And actually, I can just update my existing query to fetch the performance label, and this way we can get everything we need at once. Note that performance labels are relative to assets of the same field type within the same asset group. So a low performance label in one asset group might mean something different than a low performance label in another asset group. The results will look something like this, where I get a row for each asset with their asset group resource name, field type, and performance label. To get more information about the assets, like the headline or description text, you'd want to either query the asset resource or look up data you've stored locally about the asset if that's available to you. If you manage advertising on behalf of businesses, or you have a platform for businesses to configure their Google advertising, you might display all the lower performing assets as part of an asset group optimization workflow, where users can create a new asset of the same type to replace it. Taking this a bit further, you could show the high-performing assets of that type as examples of what leads to stronger performance. Note that it's possible that an asset group will have no assets with a low performance label. This means that all assets are considered to be working well towards your specified business goal. Let's say you have all these headline assets and their performance labels, and you've also done a lookup in your local data store for the headline text. Comparing your asset content across performance labels might tell you something about what properties of your assets are most or least performant, like whether to include the fact that free delivery is offered, what price point users can expect, or the tone of the messaging. If you don't find a common theme across your assets, it's not a problem. That might mean your assets appeal to a variety of audiences or contexts. All of these different aspects of your assets are opportunities to experiment and to iterate based on what performs best. It's another area where the way you configure your assets and asset groups can be really pivotal to overall success. If you set up your asset creation workflow in a way that lets you categorize or templatize your assets, you can learn what aspects of your assets work best in different contexts, and embrace those aspects when creating new assets. You might also supplement this performance information with data from the Asset Group Top Combination view, which offers added transparency around which asset combinations in an asset group are the highest performers. This can give you an idea of what kinds of creatives, types of assets, or sizes you might want to add more of to gain incremental performance. So where the Asset Group Asset Report gave us a performance label for each asset, the Asset Group Top Combination view gives us an idea of which assets perform well in combination. Each row of this report will contain a list of Asset Group Asset Combination data objects containing the top performing asset combinations in an asset group. For example, a single Asset Group Asset Combination data object might look like this. At the asset group level, you might find that you have a set of asset groups in your campaign that are performing extremely well. You could leverage that information to understand what types of asset groups and themes work well, and create similar asset groups and themes until you reach the asset group limit for your campaign. Okay, after all that, we've made it to our fourth and final use case I'll be covering. Identify market opportunities. One of the most exciting use cases for reporting in Performance Max is to uncover new insights and tap into market opportunities you may not even have been aware of. This is where those supplemental reporting resources I mentioned earlier are especially useful. We don't have time to go over examples for all of these reports, so for this session, I'm going to walk through examples for Campaign Search Term Insight and Customer Search Term Insight. Campaign Simulation and Location View are no less important, and I encourage you to explore the API reference and brainstorm ways you can leverage these resources for your use cases. To give you the high-level summary, Campaign Simulation can help you understand how your PMax campaigns might perform given different bidding inputs, and Location View allows you to look at your performance breakdown by location criterion. The new Search Term Insight reports are available at the campaign and customer levels and support a number of use cases, from understanding what categories of search terms are responsible for users discovering your website, to thinking of new ways to appeal to your audience through relevant ad copy. We recommend starting with the Customer Search Term Insight report, and for performance reasons, using the Campaign Search Term Insight report only once you've narrowed down your scope, to drill deeper into the higher level insights. As an example, say we want to identify our top performing search term categories from the last 7 days. We could query the Customer Search Term Insight report for category label, campaign resource name, clicks, and impressions to understand how performance looks across search categories, segmented by campaign. Further, we could compare this to the same data from previous weeks to get a sense of which categories or search terms are trending up or down. Note that you can also get subcategory and search term data from this report, but not while segmenting by campaign. In other words, subcategory and search term specific metrics are only available in aggregate at the customer level. The report data might give us the following information, showing us the plant category label has 42 clicks and 394 impressions for one campaign, and 6 clicks and 432 impressions for another. That click-through rate for the first campaign is quite a bit higher than it is for the second, so that could be an opportunity to drill deeper into the performance data for that campaign and search category. It might be the case that our assets, audience signals, or components of our setup are reaching users in a way that we could leverage for other campaigns, or for our website's landing page. Applying this in a Gaggle query, we could leverage the Campaign Search Term Insight resource to look at how performance breaks down by asset group within that campaign and the plant category label. That was a lot of content, so I want to take a second to recap before moving on to our final topic of this session. We've seen how you can use Performance Max reporting across 4 main categories of use cases: retrieve existing resources, measure performance in relation to business goals, optimize your Performance Max campaigns, and identify market opportunities. We provided a series of reporting resources you can leverage to accomplish these goals, but this was only a subset of what you can do with reporting and Performance Max in the Google Ads API, And there's plenty more for you to explore through our developer documentation. We've also seen how reporting in Performance Max is a paradigm shift away from what you might be used to with other campaign types, particularly with the importance of assets and asset groups. The final topic I'll be covering before sending you to the next session is best practices for API reporting with PMax. Some of these best practices will apply to reporting in general, but there are also tips you might find useful for Performance Max reporting in particular. I think this one generally goes without saying, but as a developer advocate and a steward of the API, I have to say it. What do I mean exactly when I say to use the API efficiently? I think of efficient API usage as following two main usage patterns. One is to fetch information in bulk and perform filtering and other processing on the client. For example, if you know that you're going to report on a specific set of campaigns, report on those campaigns all together rather than looping and sending a request for each one individually. This best practice comes with the caveat that you should apply initial filters within the query itself if you only need a subset of data. This is especially relevant when dealing with asset or product data, as the size of the response can quickly become difficult to manage for large inventories. The other usage pattern is to avoid fetching data you don't need to minimize data transfer size and latency. For example, don't fetch reports multiple times per day if you only need daily freshness. Don't fetch fields that wouldn't have changed, and instead store that info in your database. And don't fetch fields that you don't actually have a use for. Efficient use will not only reduce the likelihood that you run into any issues with rate limiting, but it will also help your reports finish more quickly and spare your resources. Next best practice is to leverage recommendations, meaning the recommendations reporting resource. Retrieving and applying recommendations is an easy way to improve your account performance. If you manage Google Ads accounts on behalf of advertisers, you could apply the recommendations directly on their behalf or present the recommendations as an option to the user to allow them to carry out the action or not. There are several recommendation types you can use to identify optimizations for your Performance Max campaigns, which are particularly useful if you provide a campaign optimization flow to your users. Each recommendation has a recommendation type-specific field, like the Maximize Conversions opt-in recommendation field here, populated with the data that's relevant to that recommendation. You can also include the recommendation.impact field to see an estimate of the impact on account performance as a result of applying the recommendation. Recommendation impact isn't available for all recommendations. For example, it's not available for improved Google tag coverage and refresh customer match list. But it is available for Maximize Conversions opt-in, Maximize Conversion Value opt-in, and Improve Performance Max ad strength. The recommendation impact field provides weekly account-level performance metrics in terms of base metrics. That's what performance metrics you're starting with. And potential metrics. That's what Google estimates your performance metrics will be after you make the recommended change. Subtracting the base metrics from the potential metrics, you can see what difference applying a given recommendation could make for your account performance. Moving on from recommendations to our next best practice. Performance Max campaigns are constantly being optimized, so data from a month ago won't be as relevant as data from this week. Where you might have relied on performance reports over a historical period to analyze trends and make adjustments, this approach is less helpful in the context of Performance Max, and you're better off relying on data that's closer to real time. Last but not least, I've said this before, but it's critical, so I'll say it again. Add as many assets as possible up to the limit for each asset type. Then wait and let Google Ads optimize for you. The more assets you add and the more variability, the more you're providing to Google's AI to be able to learn what works best for your goals and adjust accordingly. Don't optimize prematurely based on performance metrics or labels that haven't first been optimized by Google's AI, since this could lead to underinformed decisions which detract from long-term performance. You have a lot of levers you can pull to extract insights through PMax API reporting, but patience might be the mightiest lever of them all. That's a wrap for Performance Max reporting in depth. Thanks so much for joining, and I hope you found value in this session.